The golden carriage wheels rolled slowly across the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey, carrying a man who had waited longer than any heir in British history. At 73, Charles Philip Arthur George finally held the crown his mother had worn for 7 decades. But becoming king was just the beginning of his greatest challenge yet. The world watched as cameras captured every moment of his coronation, but what they couldn't see were the sleepless nights, the weight of impossible decisions, and the constant shadow of comparison to the most beloved monarch in modern history. This is the untold story of a king's first year on the throne, a year that would test everything he believed about duty, family, and the future of the British monarchy. Behind palace walls, away from the ceremonial splendor and public appearances, Charles faced questions that had no easy answers. How do you follow a legend? How do you modernize a 1,000-year-old institution while preserving its essence? And, most importantly, how do you unite a kingdom when your own family is falling apart? This is the real story of King Charles III's first birthday on the throne. Not the version told in official statements and carefully staged photographs, but the human story of a man learning to be king while the world watched and judged his every move. The morning of September 8th, 2022, started like any other day for Charles. He was at Dumfries House in Scotland, reviewing papers about his environmental initiatives when the call came. His private secretary's voice was careful, measured, but Charles knew immediately. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle. In that single moment, everything changed. Charles Philip Arthur George became King Charles III, but the weight of that transformation wouldn't fully hit him until later. Right then, he was simply a son who had lost his mother. The next few hours blurred together in a whirlwind of protocol and grief. Constitutional arrangements that had been planned for decades suddenly activated. Operation London Bridge, the code name for the Queen's death, began its careful orchestration. But for Charles, the personal and the official intertwined in ways that no amount of preparation could have readied him for. His first decision as king came within hours. The new monarch traditionally addresses the nation, but Charles chose to speak first as a son. His words were carefully crafted, yet deeply personal. The death of my beloved mother, Her Majesty the Queen, is a moment of the greatest sadness for me and all members of my family. The flight back to London felt endless. Charles stared out the window at the British countryside passing below, knowing that every person down there was now his responsibility. The fields and villages that had been his mother's for 70 years were now his to protect and serve. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. At Buckingham Palace, hundreds of people had already gathered, flowers piled up against the iron gates, and the crowd stood in respectful silence. Charles had seen this before during national tragedies, but never had he been the focus of such collective attention. As his car pulled through the palace gates, he caught glimpses of faces in the crowd, some tearful, some curious, all looking to him for leadership in this moment of national mourning. The first official meeting as king took place in the throne room. The Accession Council, a body of senior politicians, judges, and officials, formally proclaimed Charles as the new sovereign. The ceremony was steeped in tradition dating back centuries, but for Charles, it felt surreal. He had attended his mother's accession meeting as a young boy, never imagining he would one day sit in her place. I'm deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty which have now passed to me, Charles declared, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. The words were traditional, spoken by every monarch for generations, but they carried special meaning for a man who had waited his entire life to say them. The media response was immediate and intense. Every newspaper, television station, and social media platform analyzed his first hours as king. Comparisons to his mother were inevitable and often unflattering. Elizabeth II had been just 25 when she became queen, a young woman who grew into her role over decades. Charles was already an elderly man, set in his ways, with strong opinions about everything from architecture to agriculture. Behind the scenes, the palace machinery worked around the clock. Centuries-old protocols had to be followed while also adapting to modern realities. Charles's personal staff, many of whom had worked for him as Prince of Wales, suddenly found themselves serving a king. The dynamic shifted overnight, though Charles tried to maintain the personal relationships he had built over decades. One of his first private conversations was with William, his eldest son and now heir to the throne. The meeting took place in Charles's study, the same room where he had met with his own mother countless times over the years. Father and son discussed not just the immediate arrangements for the funeral and coronation, but the long-term future of the monarchy. William had his own ideas about modernizing the royal family, some of which aligned with his father's vision, others that created gentle tension. Both men understood that the monarchy needed to evolve to remain relevant, but they sometimes disagreed on the pace and direction of change. These early conversations set the tone for their relationship as king and heir, establishing boundaries and expectations that would define the next phase of the royal family's evolution. The public got their first real glimpse of Charles as king during the traditional walkabout at Buckingham Palace. Accompanied by Camilla, now queen consort, he spent over an hour greeting the crowds who had gathered to pay their respects. The interaction was telling. Charles was clearly moved by the outpouring of affection for his mother, but also seemed to understand that people were evaluating him, trying to gauge what kind of king he would be. One moment stood out to those watching carefully. A young girl in the crowd handed Charles a small bouquet of flowers, and as he knelt down to speak with her, his composure briefly cracked. The weight of the moment, the responsibility, the grief, the uncertainty about the future was visible on his face for just a few seconds before the royal mask slipped back into place. The planning for Elizabeth II's funeral began immediately, but it was also the first major test of Charles's reign. Every decision, from the guest list to the music selection, would be scrutinized as a reflection of his character and his vision for the monarchy. Charles chose to honor his mother's wishes while also making subtle statements about his own priorities. The service itself was a masterpiece of organization and emotion. Westminster Abbey filled with world leaders, while millions watched around the globe. Charles, in his military uniform, followed his mother's coffin through London streets, the same route she had taken for her coronation 70 years earlier. The symbolism was powerful, one era ending, another beginning, the continuous thread of monarchy stretching across generations. But even in that moment of pageantry and tradition, Charles was thinking about the future. His first major decision as king had been about his mother's funeral, but he knew that everything that followed would define his legacy. The crown that had waited 70 years for him was finally his, but earning the right to wear would be the work of whatever years remained to him. In the weeks following the funeral, Charles settled into the routine of kingship. The red boxes of government papers arrived daily, just as they had for his mother. The weekly meetings with the prime minister began, though the political landscape he inherited was complex and challenging. Britain was facing economic uncertainty, social divisions, and questions about its place in the world that his mother had never had to confront. The early signs suggested that Charles intended to be a different kind of monarch than his mother. Where Elizabeth had been careful to remain politically neutral, Charles had strong views on issues like climate change, social inequality, and urban planning that he had expressed freely as Prince of Wales. As king, he would need to find new ways to influence these causes without crossing constitutional boundaries. His approach to royal duties also began to evolve. Charles streamlined some ceremonial functions while emphasizing others that aligned with his personal interests. Environmental causes, interfaith dialogue, and support for traditional crafts and skills became prominent themes in his early engagements as king. The relationship with the Commonwealth realms presented another immediate challenge. Several countries had already begun discussions about becoming republics, and Charles lacked his mother's personal connections to many Commonwealth leaders. His first tour as king would be crucial in maintaining these relationships and demonstrating his commitment to the Commonwealth's continued unity. As his first months as king passed, Charles began to understand that the role was both exactly what he had expected and completely different from anything he could have imagined. The constitutional duties were familiar from his decades of preparation, but the emotional weight of being the focal point for national identity and continuity was something no amount of training could have prepared him for. The man who had been heir apparent for longer than anyone in British history was finally king, but King Charles III was still learning what that really meant. The invitation arrived at Montecito on a Tuesday morning in early October 2022. Harry stared at the heavy cream paper, embossed with the royal coat of arms, announcing his father's coronation date. May 6, 2023, Westminster Abbey. For most of the family, it was a formality, but for Harry and Meghan, it represented an impossible choice. Charles knew that his coronation would be overshadowed by family drama if he couldn't find a way to bridge the gap with his younger son. The rift had been growing for years, but it had become a chasm after Harry and Meghan's interview with Oprah Winfrey and the publication of Harry's memoir. Yet Charles still hoped that somehow the gravity of the coronation might bring them together. The first attempt at reconciliation came through unofficial channels. Charles's private secretary reached out to Harry's representatives, suggesting a private meeting before the coronation. The message was simple. The king wanted to talk to his son, not as a monarch to his subject, but as a father to his child. Harry's response was cautious, but not entirely negative. He was willing to meet, but only under specific conditions. The meeting took place at Clarence House on a gray November afternoon. Charles had chosen the location carefully. It was where Harry had lived as a teenager, a place filled with better memories. The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered years of accumulated grievances, misunderstandings, and hurt feelings. Charles listened as Harry explained his perspective on the events that had led to their estrangement. The prince spoke about feeling unsupported by the institution, about the pressure of royal life, and about his fears for Meghan's safety. Charles, in turn, shared his own feelings of disappointment and confusion about decisions that he felt had damaged the family and the monarchy. Neither man left the meeting completely satisfied, but both understood each other better than they had in years. Charles realized that Harry's criticisms weren't just personal attacks. They reflected genuine pain and a desire for change. Harry, meanwhile, saw that his father was struggling with the weight of new responsibilities while trying to maintain family relationships that seemed increasingly fragile. The media knew nothing of the meeting, but royal watchers noticed subtle changes in the official statements from both sides. The language became less hostile, more careful. Charles's office began referring to Harry and Meghan's work in more neutral terms, while Harry's public comments about the royal family became noticeably more measured. Meanwhile, Charles was dealing with another family challenge that received less public attention, but was equally complex. His relationship with Andrew, his younger brother, remained strained following the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Andrew had been effectively exiled from public royal duties, but as king, Charles had to decide what role, if any, Andrew would play in major family events like the coronation. The decision regarding Andrew reflected Charles's broader approach to royal duties. Those who could not serve the crown with dignity would not be given prominent roles, regardless of their birth rank. It was a clear signal that Charles intended to run a more streamlined, meritocratic monarchy, even when it came to his own family. Camilla's position as queen consort also required careful management. While she had gained public acceptance over the years, there were still those who remembered the painful years of Charles and Diana's marriage breakdown. Charles was determined that Camilla should be fully recognized in her role, but he was also sensitive to public opinion and the need to honor Diana's memory appropriately. The coronation planning revealed these family dynamics in sharp relief. Every decision about who would be invited, where they would sit, and what roles they would play became a delicate negotiation between personal relationships and constitutional requirements. Charles wanted the ceremony to feel inclusive while also maintaining the dignity and tradition that the public expected. William and Catherine's role in these family negotiations proved crucial. As the next generation of working royals, they served as bridges between different factions within the family. William's relationship with Harry remained complicated, but he understood the importance of family unity for the monarchy's future. Catherine, with her diplomatic skills and public popularity, helped smooth many potentially awkward situations. The decision about Harry and Meghan's attendance at the coronation became a media obsession. Charles made it clear that they were welcome, but he also understood their hesitation. The couple was building a new life in California, and attending the coronation would inevitably subject them to intense scrutiny and criticism from some quarters. Charles's approach to the situation reflected his evolution as a leader. Rather than demanding attendance or issuing ultimatums, he gave Harry and Meghan space to make their own decision while keeping communication channels open. It was a more mature approach than might have been expected from the man who had once been criticized for his rigid adherence to protocol. The breakthrough came during a private phone call in March 2023. Charles called Harry directly, without staff or advisors listening in. The conversation lasted over an hour and covered not just the coronation, but their relationship going forward. Charles expressed his pride in Harry's military service and his charitable work, while Harry acknowledged the difficulty of his father's new position. They reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but worked for everyone practically. Harry would attend the coronation alone, allowing him to show respect for his father while minimizing the media circus that would have surrounded Meghan's presence. Meghan would stay in California with their children, avoiding the inevitable comparisons to other royal family members and the rehashing of old controversies. The announcement of Harry's attendance was carefully choreographed to minimize speculation. The palace released a simple statement confirming that the Duke of Sussex would attend, while Harry's representatives emphasized that it was a private family decision made out of love and respect for his father. But the family healing process extended beyond just Harry and Meghan. Charles also had to navigate relationships with his other family members who had been affected by the recent turmoil. Princess, and always fiercely protective of the monarchy's reputation, had been frustrated by the public nature of the family disputes. Edward and Sophie, meanwhile, had quietly increased their royal duties to help fill the gap left by Harry and Andrew's reduced roles. Charles's approach to these relationships showed a growing confidence in his role as family patriarch. He was more willing to have difficult conversations and make hard decisions than he had been as Prince of Wales. The crown had given him authority that his position as heir had lacked, and he was learning to use it judiciously. The extended royal family also required attention. The cousins who carried out royal duties, Peter Phillips, Zara Tyndall, and others, found their roles shifting as Charles streamlined the monarchy. Some traditional ceremonial positions were quietly eliminated, while others were given new relevance. Charles's relationship with his stepchildren, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopez, also evolved. While they would never be working royals, Charles made efforts to include them in family celebrations and to support their own careers and families. It was part of his broader vision of a royal family that could adapt to modern realities while maintaining its essential character. The weeks leading up to the coronation saw a gradual thawing in family relationships. Not everything was resolved, and some wounds remained raw, but there was a growing sense that the family could find a way forward together. Charles's approach of patience, combined with clear expectations, seemed to be working, though slowly. The king also had to consider the impact of family dynamics on the broader Commonwealth family. Many Commonwealth leaders had personal relationships with Elizabeth II that spanned decades. Charles needed to establish his own connections while also managing how internal royal family tensions might affect these important diplomatic relationships. As the coronation approached, Charles reflected on how much his understanding of leadership had evolved. As Prince of Wales, he had often been impatient with those who disagreed with him or failed to share his vision. As king, He was learning the value of compromise and the importance of keeping families and institutions together even when individual relationships were strained. The family dinner held the night before the coronation would be the first time in years that most of the senior royals were in the same room together. Charles chose the menu personally, comfort foods that reminded him of family meals from his childhood. It was a small gesture, but one that reflected his growing understanding that healing relationships required attention to both grand gestures and intimate details. The evening was not without tension, but it was also filled with moments of genuine connection. Harry and William spoke briefly but cordially. Camilla shared stories about the grandchildren that made even the most reserved family members smile, and offered her characteristic dry humor to defuse several potentially awkward moments. Charles watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who had worked hard to bring his family together, even temporarily. The crown had given him the authority to demand attendance, but his growing wisdom as a father and grandfather had taught him that real reconciliation required patience, understanding, and the willingness to put family relationships above institutional convenience. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 a.m. on May 6, 2023, but Charles had been awake for hours. Through the windows of Buckingham Palace, he could see the crowds already gathering along the mall, despite the early morning drizzle that seemed determined to dampen the day's festivities. In just a few hours, he would be crowned King Charles III in Westminster Abbey, a moment he had been preparing for his entire life. The weight of history pressed down on him as he went through his morning routine. Every king since William the Conqueror in 1066 had faced this moment, though none had waited as long as he had. At 74, Charles was the oldest monarch ever to be crowned, a fact that added both gravitas and urgency to the ceremony. His valet helped him into the preliminary robes, the crimson velvet heavy against his shoulders. Charles caught sight of himself in the mirror and was struck by how much he resembled his great-great-grandfather, Edward VII, who had also waited decades to become king. The parallel was not lost on him. Edward had also been considered by many to be ill-suited for the throne, yet had become a popular and effective monarch. Camilla was in the adjoining room, preparing for her own historic moment. As queen consort, she would be crowned alongside Charles, the first time in over 70 years that Britain would witness a joint coronation. Her journey from the woman blamed for destroying Charles's marriage to Diana to respected queen consort had been long and difficult, but Charles knew she deserved this recognition. The first crisis of the day came at 7 a.m. when Charles's private secretary informed him that one of the Commonwealth prime ministers had fallen ill and would not be able to attend. It was a minor issue in the grand scheme of things, but it highlighted the delicate diplomatic balance that the coronation represented. Every absent dignitary, every empty seat would be noticed and interpreted. Charles's breakfast was light. He had learned from his mother that nerves and heavy food did not mix well before major ceremonies. As he ate, he reviewed his final notes for the speech he would give later that day. Unlike his mother's coronation, which had been a purely ceremonial affair, Charles had chosen to address the nation directly about his vision for his reign. The speech had been months in the making, crafted with input from constitutional experts, speechwriters, and Charles himself. It needed to honor tradition while signaling change, to be personal while remaining appropriately regal, to inspire confidence while acknowledging the challenges facing the country and the Commonwealth. At 9 a.m., the first reports came in about the protests gathering near Trafalgar Square. A group calling itself Republic had organized demonstrations calling for the abolition of the monarchy. The police estimated the crowd at several hundred, small compared to the thousands who had come to celebrate. But their presence was a reminder that not everyone in Britain supported the institution Charles was about to lead. Charles had expected the protests and was not particularly troubled by them. In fact, he saw them as a healthy sign of democratic debate. His mother had faced similar protests throughout her reign, and the monarchy had survived and even thrived. What mattered was not universal approval, but the support of the majority and the ability to serve effectively as head of state. The journey from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey began at 10:30 a.m. in the Diamond Jubilee State Coach. As the procession moved slowly through the streets of London, Charles was struck by the enthusiasm of the crowds. Despite the rain, people lined the route, waving flags and cheering. Many had been waiting since dawn. Some had traveled from across the Commonwealth, and their energy was infectious. Inside the coach, Charles felt a mixture of excitement and solemnity. This was the culmination of a lifetime of preparation, but it was also the beginning of what might be his final act of service to his country. At 74, he could not expect to reign for as long as his mother had, but he was determined to make every year count. Westminster Abbey was transformed for the occasion. The ancient building had been the site of every coronation since William the Conqueror, and its stones seemed to echo with the voices of centuries of monarchs. As Charles's coach approached, he could see the invited guests already seated inside: world leaders, Commonwealth representatives, members of Parliament, and carefully selected members of the public. The guest list itself had been a delicate diplomatic exercise. President Biden represented the United States, President Macron came from France, and dozens of other world leaders were present. But there were notable absences, too. Russia and China had not been invited due to ongoing tensions, and several Commonwealth nations had sent lower-level representatives, a sign of the monarchy's weakening hold on some former colonies. Inside the Abbey, Harry sat in the third row, his presence both a relief and a source of tension for Charles. The father-son reconciliation was still fragile, and Harry's decision to attend alone had been carefully calculated to show respect while maintaining his independence. Charles hoped it was a first step toward healing their relationship, but he also understood that deep wounds would take time to heal. The ceremony itself was a blend of ancient ritual and modern adaptation. Charles had chosen to modernize some elements. The service was shorter than his mother's, included more diverse music, and featured readings in multiple languages to reflect Britain's multicultural society. But the core elements remained unchanged: the recognition, the oath, the anointing, the investiture, and the enthronement. When Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby placed the St. Edward's crown on Charles's head, the weight was both literal and metaphorical. The crown, made for the coronation of Charles II in 1661, weighed over 5 pounds, but it carried the weight of 1,000 years of history and tradition. Charles felt the eyes of the world upon him as he became, officially and sacramentally, King Charles III. The moment of anointing was particularly meaningful for Charles. This ancient ritual, performed behind screens to maintain its sacred privacy, represented the spiritual dimension of kingship that had always been important to him. As the holy oil was applied to his hands, breast, and head, Charles felt a profound sense of consecration to his role as servant of his people. Camilla's coronation followed immediately after, a historic moment that Charles had fought for years to make possible. As the Queen Mary crown was placed on her head, Charles felt a surge of pride for the woman who had supported him through decades of public criticism and personal challenges. Her recognition as queen consort was not just a personal victory, but a sign of the monarchy's ability to evolve and adapt. The recognition ceremony, where the congregation acknowledged Charles as their king, was emotionally overwhelming. To hear 2,000 voices proclaim, "God save the King," in Westminster Abbey was to feel the weight of national acceptance and support. Despite the protests outside and the Republican voices in the media, this was a moment of unity and celebration that transcended political divisions. The investiture with the royal regalia was rich with symbolism. Each item, the orb, the scepters, the ring, represented different aspects of royal authority and responsibility. As Charles held the sovereign's orb, topped with a cross to symbolize the divine source of royal authority, he reflected on the burden of leadership in an increasingly secular age. The enthronement in King Edward's chair, the same seat used for coronation since 1308, connected Charles to nearly 7 centuries of predecessors. The chair, containing the stone of destiny beneath its seat, represented the unity of the United Kingdom and the consent of the nations to his rule. The moment that touched Charles most deeply came during the homage ceremony. William, as heir to the throne, knelt before his father and pledged his loyalty as both son and subject. The personal and constitutional merged in that moment, as Charles received homage not just from the Prince of Wales, but from his beloved eldest son. The new king's first words to the nation as crowned monarch were carefully chosen to set the tone for his reign. He spoke of service, dedication to the Commonwealth, commitment to environmental protection, and the importance of faith and community in modern society. The speech was brief but comprehensive, touching on themes that would define his kingship. As the ceremony concluded with the national anthem, Charles felt a profound sense of completion and beginning. The long wait was over, the crown was his, but the real work was just starting. The cheers from the congregation and the sound of bells ringing across London marked not an end, but a transformation. The procession back to Buckingham Palace was even more spectacular than the journey to the Abbey. The newly crowned king and queen traveled in the Gold State coach, used only for the most significant occasions. Along the route, the crowds were larger and more enthusiastic than they had been in the morning, as if the ceremony had validated their celebration. The traditional balcony appearance at Buckingham Palace provided the iconic images that would define the day. Charles and Camilla, wearing their crowns and ceremonial robes, waved to the cheering crowds below. They were joined by William, Catherine, and their children, representing the future of the monarchy. As the day drew to a close and the crowds dispersed, Charles reflected on what had been accomplished. The coronation had been a success by any measure, well-organized, dignified, celebratory, and inclusive. More importantly, it had demonstrated the monarchy's continued relevance and the public support for the institution. But Charles also understood that a coronation, however magnificent, was just a beginning. The crown was his, but earning the right to wear it would be the work of however many years remained to him. The real test of his reign would come not in moments of pageantry, but in the quiet, daily work of constitutional duty and public service. That evening, as he finally removed the crown and ceremonial robes, Charles felt both exhausted and energized. The boy who had watched his mother's coronation on television 70 years earlier was now King Charles III, crowned and anointed, ready to serve his people for whatever time God granted him. 3 months after his coronation, King Charles III sat in his study at Balmoral Castle, surrounded by briefing papers that would have seemed impossible during his mother's reign. Climate change reports, diversity statistics for the royal household, proposals for streamlining the monarchy, and constitutional questions about the future of the Commonwealth created a pile of documents that represented the challenging landscape of modern kingship. The summer of 2023 marked a turning point in Charles's approach to his role. The coronation had been about continuity and tradition, but now came the harder task of demonstrating that the monarchy could evolve without losing its essential character. Charles had spent decades as heir apparent developing strong opinions about everything from urban planning to interfaith dialogue. And as king, he needed to find ways to influence these causes without overstepping constitutional boundaries. His first major initiative was the launch of the King's Climate Corps, a program that combined traditional royal patronage with urgent environmental action. The program brought together young people from across the Commonwealth to work on climate adaptation projects, from reforestation in Canada to renewable energy development in the Caribbean. It was classic Charles, practical, international in scope, and focused on long-term solutions rather than short-term publicity. The announcement of the Climate Corps revealed Charles's evolving approach to public communication as king. Unlike his mother, who rarely gave interviews and spoke publicly only on ceremonial occasions, Charles chose to participate in a documentary about climate change, explaining his environmental philosophy and the urgency he felt about addressing global warming. The interview was carefully controlled, but it showed a monarch willing to use his platform to advocate for causes he believed in. The reaction was mixed, but mostly positive. Environmental groups praised the king's leadership, while constitutional experts debated whether his activism was appropriate for a head of state. Charles had expected the criticism and was prepared for it. He believed that the existential threat of climate change justified a more active royal role, and he was willing to test the boundaries of traditional royal neutrality. The modernization of royal communications extended beyond environmental issues. Charles's team launched new social media strategies that showed the monarchy's daily work in more detail and with less formality than had been traditional. Behind-the-scenes videos of royal engagements, informal photographs of the king at work, and regular updates on royal projects created a more accessible image of the monarchy. This new approach to publicity was partly driven by necessity. The younger generation, particularly those in Commonwealth countries, had less automatic deference to royal authority and needed to be convinced of the monarchy's relevance. Charles understood that he could not rely on the personal affection that his mother had built up over 70 years of service. He needed to demonstrate the monarchy's value through action and engagement. The challenge was particularly acute in the Caribbean Commonwealth realms, where Republican movements had gained momentum. Charles's first tour of the region as king in October 2023 was seen as crucial for maintaining these constitutional relationships. Unlike traditional royal visits focused on ceremony and courtesy, this tour was designed around substantive engagement with climate adaptation, economic development, and cultural preservation. In Jamaica, Charles made history by acknowledging the royal family's historical connection to slavery more directly than any previous monarch. Speaking at the University of the West Indies, he expressed deep sorrow for the institution of slavery and the royal family's past involvement in it. The speech was carefully worded to avoid direct apologies, which could have legal implications, but it went further than any previous royal statement on the subject. The response in Jamaica was complex. Many appreciated the king's acknowledgement of historical wrongs, while others felt it was too little, too late. Republican leaders argued that symbolic gestures could not address the need for constitutional change and reparations. But Charles's willingness to engage with difficult historical questions at least showed that the monarchy was not ignoring these issues. The tour also highlighted Charles's approach to royal diplomacy. Rather than the formal ceremonies and state banquets that had characterized his mother's visits, Charles chose smaller, more focused events that allowed for real conversation and engagement. He spent time with climate scientists, met with young entrepreneurs, and participated in community projects that demonstrated practical royal support for local initiatives. Back in Britain, Charles was also pushing forward with institutional changes within the royal household itself. The monarch had long been one of the country's largest private employers, and Charles was determined to make the royal household a model of modern employment practices. New policies on diversity, mental health support, and environmental sustainability were implemented across all royal properties. The changes were not always popular within the palace. Some long-serving staff members struggled with new expectations about diversity training and environmental protocols. Charles faced the challenge that confronts any leader trying to modernize a traditional institution: how to bring change without losing the loyalty and expertise of existing employees. One of the most significant changes was the restructuring of the working royal family itself. Charles had long advocated for a slimmed-down monarchy, and as king, he had the authority to implement this vision. The number of working royals was reduced to focus on the immediate family line, while ceremonial roles were either eliminated or redistributed among the remaining active members. This streamlining was partly financial. A smaller royal family meant lower cost to taxpayers, but it was also strategic. Charles believed that a more focused monarchy would be more effective and would face less public criticism about royal privilege and excess. The change also reflected the reality that several family members, including Harry and Andrew, were no longer available for or suitable for public duties. The impact on the remaining working royals was significant. William and Catherine found their responsibilities expanded considerably, while Edward and Sophie took on additional duties to maintain the monarchy's public presence. The workload was demanding, but it also gave each working royal greater prominence and the opportunity to develop their own areas of expertise. Charles's relationship with the Church of England also evolved during this period. As supreme governor of the Church, the king had constitutional responsibilities that his personal faith took very seriously. However, Charles had long been interested in interfaith dialogue and wanted to position the monarchy as representing all faiths in increasingly diverse Britain. His approach was characteristically thoughtful and sometimes controversial. Charles continued to attend Church of England services and fulfill his ceremonial duties as supreme governor, but he also made unprecedented visits to mosques, synagogues, and temples. He spoke about the monarchy's role in protecting all religious communities and defending the principle of religious freedom for everyone. Conservative church leaders and traditionalist commentators criticized these initiatives as undermining the monarchy's Christian identity. Charles responded by arguing that defending religious freedom for all strengthened rather than weakened the position of Christianity in British society. It was a nuanced argument that reflected his decades of thinking about faith, society, and the role of established institutions. The king's interest in architecture and urban planning also found new expression in his royal role. Charles had been criticized as Prince of Wales for his strong opinions about modern architecture and his advocacy for traditional design principles. As king, he found more diplomatic ways to promote these interests through patronage of architectural education and support for sustainable building practices. The Prince's Foundation, Charles's educational charity focused on traditional crafts and sustainable practices, was expanded and given a higher profile. The organization's work in training young people in traditional building skills, organic farming, and artisanal crafts aligned with both Charles's personal interests and his broader vision of sustainable development. International recognition of Charles's environmental leadership grew throughout this period. He was invited to address the United Nations Climate Summit in November 2023, becoming the first reigning British monarch to speak to the UN General Assembly. His speech focused on the urgency of climate action and the role that traditional knowledge and sustainable practices could play in addressing environmental challenges. The UN appearance was controversial in Britain, with some arguing that the king was overstepping his constitutional role by taking such a prominent position on a political issue. Charles's response was that climate change was not a political issue, but an existential challenge that transcended party politics. He argued that the monarchy's role in promoting international cooperation made environmental leadership not just appropriate, but necessary. Parliamentary questions about the king's political activities led to private meetings with party leaders from across the political spectrum. Charles used these conversations to explain his thinking and to seek consensus on the appropriate boundaries for royal activism. The discussions were frank but respectful, reflecting the constitutional tradition that allows for private dialogue between the monarch and political leaders. The meetings also revealed the complexity of modern constitutional monarchy. Political leaders appreciated the king's passion and expertise on environmental issues, but they were also concerned about maintaining the monarchy's traditional neutrality. Charles had to navigate between his personal convictions and his constitutional duties, finding ways to lead on important issues without becoming a partisan political figure. As 2023 drew to a close, Charles reflected on the progress and challenges of his first year as king. The monarchy had successfully adapted to his leadership style while maintaining public support and constitutional propriety. The environmental initiatives were gaining international recognition. The modernization of royal communications was reaching new audiences, and the streamlined royal family was proving more effective than critics had expected. But Charles also understood that the real test of his reign would come not in its first year, but in how well the changes he was implementing would serve the monarchy's long-term future. The crown that had waited 70 years for him would need to be adapted for the realities of the 21st century, and that adaptation would require continued evolution, careful judgment, and the wisdom to know when tradition should be preserved and when change was necessary. September 8th, 2024, marked exactly 2 years since Queen Elizabeth II had passed away and 1 year since Charles had been crowned King Charles III. As he stood in the same study at Balmoral where he had received the news of his mother's death, Charles contemplated how profoundly his life and the monarchy itself had changed in those 12 months since his coronation. The morning began quietly, as Charles preferred. He had declined suggestions for a large public celebration of his first anniversary as crowned monarch, choosing instead to spend the day in private reflection and then meeting with representatives from some of the causes closest to his heart. The decision was characteristic of his approach to kingship, substance over ceremony, meaningful engagement over pageantry. At breakfast, Camilla joined him in reviewing the morning papers. The coverage was largely positive, with most newspapers acknowledging that Charles had confounded his critics by proving to be a more effective and popular king than many had expected. The Times ran an editorial titled "The Unexpected King," praising his environmental leadership and his successful modernization of royal communications. However, not all the coverage was favorable. The Daily Mail questioned whether the king's environmental activism had crossed constitutional boundaries, while The Guardian argued that his reforms had not gone far enough in addressing the monarchy's fundamental issues with privilege and relevance. Charles read both perspectives with the equanimity he had developed over decades in public life. Praise and criticism were both temporary, but the work of kingship was permanent. The first meeting of the day was with Sir David Attenborough, the renowned naturalist who had become an unofficial advisor to the king on environmental matters. They discussed the progress of the king's climate corps, which had expanded beyond Charles's original vision to include programs in 30 Commonwealth countries. Young people from across the former empire were working together on everything from coral reef restoration in the Maldives to renewable energy projects in rural Kenya. Attenborough brought encouraging news about the program's impact. Not only were the environmental projects showing measurable results, but the international cooperation and cultural exchange aspects were strengthening Commonwealth relationships in ways that traditional diplomacy had struggled to achieve. Young people who had worked together on climate projects were maintaining connections and collaborations that crossed national boundaries. The conversation also touched on the challenges ahead. Climate change was accelerating faster than many had predicted, and the political will for necessary changes remained inconsistent across different countries. Charles expressed frustration that the urgency of the crisis was not matched by the speed of global response, but Attenborough counseled patience and persistence. After Attenborough's visit, Charles spent an hour reviewing reports from the streamlined royal household. The changes he had implemented were showing positive results across multiple metrics. Public approval ratings for the monarchy had actually increased during his first year as king, contrary to predictions that his approach would be too radical for public taste. The financial reports were particularly encouraging. The slimmed-down monarchy was operating more efficiently while actually increasing its public engagement. Fewer working royals meant that each had a higher profile and could develop deeper expertise in their areas of responsibility. The focused approach was proving more effective than the previous model of spreading activities across a larger number of family members. William and Catherine had emerged as particularly effective partners in this new arrangement. Their increased responsibilities had allowed them to develop substantial programs in mental health, early childhood development, and homelessness prevention. The Prince and Princess of Wales were attracting international attention for their innovative approaches to royal patronage, combining traditional ceremonial duties with hands-on involvement in addressing social problems. The relationship between Charles and his eldest son had deepened during the king's first year on the throne. Their weekly private meetings had evolved from formal briefings to substantive discussions about the future direction of the monarchy. William brought perspectives shaped by his generation's values, while respecting the constitutional requirements of his role as heir. Charles was particularly pleased with how Catherine had adapted to her increased prominence. Her natural diplomatic skills and genuine interest in social issues had made her an effective advocate for the causes she had taken on. The public clearly saw her as a future queen who would bring both dignity and accessibility to the role. The afternoon brought a more challenging conversation with Charles's private secretary about the ongoing situation with Harry. The relationship between father and son remained fragile, but had not deteriorated further since the coronation. Harry had participated in a few family events via video call and had sent warm messages for Charles's birthday, but the deeper reconciliation that Charles hoped for remained elusive. Recent media reports suggested that Harry was considering writing another book, though this time focused on his military service rather than royal family conflicts. Charles's team was cautiously optimistic that this project would not create new tensions, but they were also prepared for the possibility that any Harry publication would inevitably involve some family commentary. The situation with Harry highlighted one of the ongoing challenges of Charles's reign, balancing his roles as father and king. His desire to heal family relationships sometimes conflicted with the institutional needs of the monarchy. Charles had learned to compartmentalize these tensions without resolving them, accepting that some problems would require years rather than months to address. An unexpected development in the afternoon was news that the government of Jamaica had officially announced its intention to move toward Republican status. Charles had been expecting this decision since his visit to the Caribbean the previous year, and his reaction was more philosophical than disappointed. He understood that the evolution of Commonwealth relationships was a natural process that reflected the maturation of formerly colonized nations. The Jamaican announcement prompted discussions about the future of the Commonwealth realms and the monarchy's international role. Charles's team had been quietly preparing for the possibility that several Caribbean nations would choose to become republics during his reign. The strategy was to facilitate these transitions amicably while maintaining strong Commonwealth relationships and demonstrating that constitutional change could occur without damaging bilateral relations. Charles's approach to these constitutional changes reflected his broader philosophy of adaptive leadership. Rather than fighting inevitable evolution, he chose to guide it in directions that preserved what was valuable while allowing for necessary change. It was a more mature approach than the defensive strategies that might have characterized earlier royal responses to such challenges. The evening's most significant event was a private dinner with Commonwealth High Commissioners and ambassadors based in London. Charles had initiated these regular gatherings as a way of maintaining direct communication with Commonwealth partners and understanding their perspectives on the monarchy's evolving role. The conversations were frank and sometimes challenging. Representatives from newer Commonwealth members questioned whether the monarchy remained relevant to their country's needs and aspirations. Pacific Island nations spoke about the existential threat of climate change and their need for practical assistance rather than ceremonial visits. Charles listened carefully to these concerns and responded with characteristic honesty about the monarchy's limitations and potential. He acknowledged that royal symbolism could not solve practical problems, but argued that the monarchy's convening power and international platform could be valuable tools for addressing shared challenges. The High Commissioner from Ghana raised questions about reparations for historical injustices, a topic that had become increasingly prominent in Commonwealth discussions. Charles reiterated his expressions of regret for the Crown's historical involvement in slavery, while explaining the constitutional constraints that prevented him from making formal apologies or commitments to reparations. These conversations illustrated the complexity of Charles's position as both a national monarch and a Commonwealth head. He needed to balance the interests and perspectives of dozens of different countries while maintaining his primary responsibilities to the United Kingdom. The role required diplomatic skills that went far beyond the ceremonial functions that many people associated with monarchy. As the day drew to a close, Charles retreated to his private study for an hour of solitary reflection. He thought about his mother and how proud she would have been of the monarchy's continued evolution and relevance. Elizabeth II had given the institution 70 years of stability and dignity. Charles's task was to ensure that those foundations supported whatever changes were necessary for the monarchy's future survival and effectiveness. The challenges ahead were significant. Climate change would continue to accelerate, requiring ever more urgent action. Social inequality and political polarization were growing in many countries. The Commonwealth was becoming more diverse and assertive, with many members questioning traditional relationships. Technological change was transforming how people related to institutions and authority figures. But Charles also felt optimistic about the monarchy's ability to adapt and contribute to addressing these challenges. His first year as king had demonstrated that the institution could evolve without losing its essential character. The environmental leadership was gaining international recognition and influence. The streamlined royal family was proving more effective than critics had predicted. Public support remained strong, and younger generations were beginning to see the monarchy as relevant to their concerns. Most importantly, Charles had found his voice as king. The long years of preparation had given him deep knowledge and strong convictions about the issues facing the world. The crown had provided him with a platform and authority that allowed him to contribute to solutions rather than just highlighting problems. As he prepared for bed on this anniversary evening, Charles felt a profound sense of gratitude for the opportunity to serve and a quiet confidence about the future. The crown that had waited 70 years for him had proven to be worth the wait. The boy who had watched his mother's coronation was now a king in his own right, with his own vision and his own contribution to make to the long story of British monarchy. The first birthday on the throne had passed peacefully, but Charles understood that it was just the beginning. The real measure of his reign would not be found in anniversary celebrations or favorable newspaper coverage, but in whether the monarchy emerged from his stewardship stronger, more relevant, and better equipped to serve future generations. Looking out at the Scottish hills surrounding Balmoral, Charles reflected that his mother had been right about the nature of royal service. It was not about personal satisfaction or achievement, but about the quiet, persistent work of serving something larger than oneself. The crown was not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be carried, and Charles was determined to carry it with dignity, purpose, and hope for whatever years remained to him.